What if the smartest way to save a dying business wasn't a bigger machine, but 4 hooves, a dog, and a box of bees? Stay with this one, because by the end you'll understand a lesson that applies far beyond farming. In the Hudson Valley of upstate New York, on a gray morning in late September, mist hung low over an old apple orchard. The trees stood in uneven lines, bent from decades of wind and frost. Some branches were bare, others still held small, freckled apples clinging on like the last proof that the farm hadn't quite given up. The grass between the rows had grown wild. The ground was packed hard from years of tractor wheels. Near the barn sat an old flatbed truck with a flat tire and a windshield gone cloudy with age. But if you stood at the fence line that morning, the sound you'd hear wasn't an engine. It was hooves. 2 enormous Belgian draft horses moved between the trees, steam rising from their breath. Behind them, a wooden cart rattled softly, loaded with buckets of compost and hand tools. A scruffy red and white heeler dog wove around a loose group of hens, nudging them back into line. Along the tree line, wooden beehive boxes faced the rising sun, and walking behind it all, in muddy boots and a canvas coat, was Marin Doyle. Marin was 39. She had no degree in agriculture, no farming background, no investors lined up, no shiny new equipment. For over 15 years, she'd worked as a logistics manager for a shipping company 2 hours south, spending her days buried in spreadsheets, delivery schedules, and inventory reports. But 8 months earlier, she had inherited her grandmother's struggling apple orchard, and everyone around her said the same thing: sell it. Her neighbors said it kindly. The bank said it plainly. A longtime orchard owner down the road said it like the decision had already been made for her. The land was too tired. The equipment was too old. The trees needed more work than any one person could give them. One farmer, who'd worked apples for over 30 years, told her flatly, "You're not saving a farm. Marin, you're buying yourself years of grief." But Marin didn't sell. Instead, she brought in 2 horses, a rescue dog, a flock of hens, and 30 beehives. Within a single year, that fading orchard became the place everyone in the county was suddenly talking about. To understand why she trusted horses and bees and chickens with her family's future, you have to understand what she was afraid of losing. Marin had grown up on that land. As a kid, she'd spent every summer running barefoot through the rows with her cousins, picking up dropped apples, catching fireflies after dinner. Her great-grandfather planted the oldest trees. Her grandmother had expanded the orchard in the 70s, back when a small farm could still make it. They were never wealthy, but there was always enough. Enough apples for the roadside stand, enough cider pressed each fall, enough eggs for breakfast and hay for the barn, enough work to leave everyone tired, and enough beauty in the place to make the tiredness feel earned. But time moves on. Marin left for college. Her cousins scattered across the country. Her grandmother's health declined slowly, then quickly. Small things stopped getting fixed: a sagging fence, an overgrown field, a truck that needed a new transmission but never got one. A few thin harvests turned into several. By the time her grandmother passed, the orchard was still standing, but only just. When Marin finally opened the old farm ledgers, the story they told was blunt. 3 years of losses in a row. Fuel costs climbing. Repairs piling up. The truck breaking down twice in one season. Whole sections of trees flowering but barely fruiting. The soil in the oldest rows had gone hard as pavement. Rain pooled on top instead of soaking in. Weeds choked out the roots, and the trees looked worn thin. A local consultant walked the land with her that winter. He was polite but direct. The practical move was to clear a large section of the old trees and replant with a modern, high-density system. "Start fresh," he said. "It'll take years, but it's the cleanest path. Marin looked at the row her great-grandfather had planted, the trees her grandmother had pruned every February for 40 years, the exact spot where she'd learned to ride a bike. Starting over sounded simple to someone standing outside it. To Marin, it felt like erasing the last living piece of her family. For a few weeks, she nearly agreed. She met with a real estate agent. She called the bank. She even had a conversation with a regional orchard company that wanted the land. Then, one evening, while clearing out a storage loft above the barn office, she found a metal box tucked behind old paint cans. Inside were her great-grandfather's field notebooks, nothing fancy, just pencil notes on weather, harvests, tree varieties, repairs, and animals. One line stopped her cold. Let the animals finish what the machine only starts. She sat on the loft floor for nearly 2 hours reading. Her great-grandfather had used draft horses in the orchard long before tractors took over, not for every task, but for the jobs where a heavy machine did more harm than good. The horses hauled wagons and pruned limbs and worked the soft ground without crushing it. He'd kept bees to help with pollination. He'd run hens through the orchard in certain seasons to eat fallen fruit, clean up insects, and interrupt pest cycles. And he'd trained farm dogs not as pets, but as working partners who moved animals exactly where they were needed. To most people, it would look old-fashioned. To Marin, it looked like a system. That was the turning point. She realized she couldn't outspend the bigger farms nearby. She didn't have their money, their machinery, or their crews. So she asked a different question. What if the answer wasn't bigger equipment, but quieter help? Over the next 2 months, she researched everything she could. She visited a horse-powered vegetable farm 2 counties over. She spent a weekend with a beekeeper learning the seasonal rhythms of a hive. She called other orchard owners who used poultry for pest control. She filled a notebook with costs, schedules, and mistakes to avoid. By late winter, she decided. She sold a nearly new utility ATV her grandmother had bought the year before she got sick. She dipped into savings and negotiated some breathing room with the bank. Then, she bought 2 trained Belgian draft horses, a pair named Gus and Nell. Gus broad and patient with a crooked blaze down his nose. Nell smaller, dark, and stubborn in a way Marin came to respect. Next came the dog, a 2-year-old heeler mix from a shelter named Radar. Too much energy for city life, but exactly the right mind for a farm. Then a deal with a local beekeeper named Eli Foss, who placed 30 hives along the orchard's sunniest edge in exchange for the nectar flow and a share of the honey. Finally, 60 hardy hens, built for cold weather and long days scratching under the trees. The neighbors joked immediately. One said she was opening a petting zoo. The feed store clerk raised an eyebrow when she ordered horse tack, poultry netting, and beehive frames in the same week. But Marin had spent 15 years reading numbers for a living. She knew that small repeated costs could sink an operation and that small repeated savings could rebuild one. She built her whole plan around that idea. The horses would cut down tractor use and spare the soil from constant compaction. The hens would rotate through sections in portable fencing, eating pests and leaving natural fertilizer behind. Radar would move the flock without Marin losing half a day chasing birds. The bees would support the bloom and give the farm a second product to sell. It sounded tidy on paper. Living it was another matter. The first month was chaos. Gus refused to walk past a flapping tarp for a week straight. Nell figured out how to lean on a gate until the latch gave. Radar, overexcited, once scattered the whole flock into a blackberry thicket, and Marin spent a freezing afternoon on her knees under low branches coaxing hens back into the pen, while the dog watched like it was all part of the plan. A late frost slowed the bees' spring buildup, and Marin worried they wouldn't be strong enough for bloom. Eli told her bees don't run on a human calendar, they run on weather and light and instinct, and patience was the only tool that mattered. The horses needed care every single day, sick or tired or not, and there were mornings her hands went numb before sunrise and her back ached before breakfast. More than once she stood alone in the barn and wondered if everyone else had been right after all. She kept going anyway. By March, small changes started showing. The horses moved slowly enough that Marin noticed things she'd have missed from a truck seat: a cracked limb here, standing water there, which trees needed real pruning. The orchard stopped feeling like a failing line item and started feeling alive again. By April, the hens were working their rotations, scratching through old leaves, breaking down fallen fruit, spreading manure in thin natural layers. Radar learned to guide instead of chase. Marin learned to read his posture, the way he'd drop his head and slow his pace right before the flock moved like water around him. Then came bloom, beautiful and nerve-wracking all at once, the few weeks that can decide an entire season. The old trees burst into pink and white. Marin walked the rows before sunrise with coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other, watching temperature and wind. When the sun warmed the hives, the bees came out in waves, and within an hour the whole orchard hummed. Standing under the oldest tree, the one her great-grandfather had planted nearest the barn, she cried for the first time since the funeral, not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in years, the farm didn't feel like it was ending. By early summer, the proof was undeniable. The rotated ground held less standing water. The compost-fed soil under the old rows had started to soften. The trees were carrying more young fruit than the year before. Fuel costs dropped. The truck still ran sometimes, but it wasn't the center of the operation anymore. At the farm stand, Marin hung a hand-painted sign: apples, eggs, honey, animals at work. Visitors came first out of curiosity, then kept coming for the eggs and honey, and their kids came just to watch Radar move the flock. Even the skeptical old farmer down the road stopped by that July, watched Gus and Nell haul a cart of compost down the center row, and said, "That's a lot of work for something a tractor does in 10 minutes. Marin agreed and added that the tractor never left the soil better than it found it. He didn't argue back. By fall, harvest arrived, and the orchard gave more than anyone expected. Not a miracle, but the best crop in years, even from the old trees the consultant had wanted, cleared first. Her cousin flew in to help pick, and together they filled bins pulled by Gus and Nell while Radar rode proudly in the truck bed. He filmed a short clip one foggy morning, the horses moving through the mist, Marin walking beside them, the trees glowing gold, and posted it with a simple caption about his cousin saving their grandmother's orchard with horses, bees, and one very serious dog. It spread fast. People drove in from other towns, some for the apples, some for the honey, some just to see the horses, and some because in a world that felt increasingly automated, the sight of someone rebuilding a farm by hand felt like something they didn't know they'd been missing. Months later, on a quiet afternoon after the crowds had thinned, the old farmer who'd once warned her off came back and walked the rows beside her in silence. Finally, he stopped near one of the oldest trees and said, "Your grandmother would have liked this." Marin looked out at the horses, the hens, the hives, and Radar sitting watchfully by the gate, and said simply, "I hope so." 1 year after nearly selling everything, the numbers told a different story. Fuel and repair costs were down sharply. Fruit production was up. Egg sales brought steady weekly income. Honey became one of the farm stand's best sellers. Marin wasn't rich, and she never expected to be. She still worked long days, still worried over weather, still dealt with broken fences and sick animals and hard calls. Farming hadn't become easy just because she'd chosen an older way of doing it, but it had become possible again. And more than that, it had become meaningful. Here's the lesson underneath the whole story. Marin didn't save that orchard by pretending the old ways were flawless, and she didn't save it with nostalgia alone. She saved it by combining what the past still had to teach with the discipline of someone who understood numbers, patience, and systems. She used her professional skills to track every cost. She used her grandmother's records to understand the land's real condition. She used her great-grandfather's notes to remember what animals could actually do for soil and pests that machines couldn't. And she let the farm heal at the pace living things heal, not on a deadline, not overnight, but season by season. That's a principle that reaches far past farming. The newest, biggest, fastest tool isn't automatically the right one. Sometimes the smarter fix is slower, quieter, and older than you'd expect. And the real skill is knowing which problem calls for which kind of solution. Marin Doyle didn't have the ideal background. She didn't have the money people assumed she'd need. She didn't have her neighbor's confidence when she started. What she had was a tired orchard, a box of handwritten notes, a plan built on real numbers, and the stubborn belief that land remembers how to come back to life if someone gives it the chance. In 12 months, she turned a failing upstate New York orchard into a place that made strangers slow down and reconsider what progress actually looks like. Because sometimes progress doesn't arrive with a bigger engine. Sometimes it walks in on 4 steady legs, hums quietly in the blossoms, and waits patiently for one person willing to listen.